Tonight, I am joined by a new friend of mine, Jonathan TranPham. He is the founder and CEO of Reflect, which is a startup that's on a mission to make mental health more accessible. He started Reflect after his own frustrating therapy search, and Reflect uses fit-based matching to help you find the right therapist.
Welcome to The Mandate, a show featuring intimate conversations about men's mental health, masculinity, and identity. We bring you stories to inspire you, experts to guide you, and the tools you need to become the man you truly want to be. It's time to sit back, relax, and open up. Live from the Mandate Studio in Austin, Texas, here's your host, Adam Hoffman.
So, Jonathan, thanks for coming on and hanging out tonight. It's good to see you.
It is great to be here. Thanks for having me, Adam.
Yeah, for sure, man. How you doing?
I am good. I feel like after 2020, I'm just happy to be here. And I think we're recognizing, the bar is now just getting through. So I feel like it is the best we got right now.
Yeah, 2020 definitely did a number on us. It looks like the latest joke that resonated with me was that this is like 2020 version 1, where we just got out of 2020 version 0. But we're gonna make the best of it. And mental health obviously is at the forefront and is on the top of all of our minds, whether we know it or not. It's certainly there. So I think we're having some slight connection issues. It might be on my end, but can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Well, then we'll just get rolling, because as long as people can hear you, we are good to go. So I'd love to hear. Tell us about what has your journey been like with mental health?
Yeah, it's really interesting because for someone who had not thought about mental health for 30 plus years of my life, like I don't think I've mentioned that term once, and growing up, I didn't really talk about my own mental health a lot. It's something that I think about a lot right now. And I think we're having this moment where more and more of us are thinking about it. But usually it happens when something bad happens. So for me, my mental health journey was one where, I realized a few years ago, after a career in consulting and working at an early stage startup, that I was stressed and had probably been stressed my whole life. Thank you, Tiger Mom. And my 6-month search for a therapist added more stress to my life. And I think what was surprising to me was, as I started going to therapy, things that I took for granted, just like, oh, that's just how everyone sees the world, or that's just how everyone reacts to stress. It was really eye-opening to realize that actually that's my own personal journey. And there was a lot of good habits and a lot of bad habits that I was learning throughout my life. And so having never thought about it, really, I quit, that search for a therapist and really that kind of burnout situation made me realize that I should be paying attention to my mental health more often. And actually, it's something that's not just something I notice, but I can actually actively influence.
Yeah, got it. There's a couple things that stood out to me that you touched on. Let's go into kind of how did Jonathan get to this point in his life? And you mentioned Tiger Mom. What was Jonathan's upbringing? How did you get to be a consultant that then burned himself out and decides to go start a company?
Yeah. So, and I ask myself, sometimes I wake up and I go, how did I get here? I ask myself that question every few days. So, so a little bit about my background for those who don't know. So my family originally were refugees from Vietnam. So they came to America in 1975 at the fall of Saigon. Literally, were living in their homes. My grandfather was a senior colonel in the South Vietnamese Army. And then overnight, were refugees in a refugee camp in the South Pacific. I was born in the States in the 80s, and really grew up with a very, very, a single mom who really cared about me and gave me a lot of love. But recognizing that she was going through her own adjustment coming to America, learning a language for the first time, and doing the best that she could raising me. And so a little bit of that kind of immigrant mentality is, I think, what's really helped me, my work ethic, how much I really push myself. And there was a lot of survival mentality as an immigrant. And so that was what I learned early on, was like, you have to survive and you have to really work really hard and really go extra. And I think that continuous voice in my head of always having to work harder was something that I just grew up with and I never really thought about. And ended up going to college at Northwestern and studying organizational psychology. And loved always thinking about how people react within organizations. Again, never thinking about my own self. And so I was like, okay, I want to go out and see this in action. And so I became a consultant. I worked for a company called Monitor Group, and then another one called Bain and Company, basically doing strategy consulting, working what I thought was very normal 80-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks. And I think really this is sort of like a theme for me, is recognizing like there are things I just didn't realize were things I didn't know I didn't even know. And so it was really kind of pushing myself, excelling at work, eventually going to grad school, and then getting to a point where, I was just like, okay, if you're in a situation where things are really difficult, you just got to push through. And I think you could push through for a long time. And at some point you realize, God, this is just going to catch up with me. And I was burned out. I wasn't really sleeping very well. I was pretty anxious. And that was really I didn't really notice it, but it was when my friends were saying, hey, have you thought about seeing a therapist? That I was like, okay, this is something that I think it's the world and the universe saying to me that I got to pay attention to my mental health a little bit more.
Got it. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to the friends telling you to go see a therapist, because I think that's a fun thing to explore, rather an interesting thing to explore. But first, I want to come back to, you talked about the mentality of just like, keep working, keep grinding, like just stay at it, tough it out sort of a thing. A lot of times that's come up in conversation that I've had so far on the show as like something that is a particular thing that we learn as men, as like, you just got to keep going, you just got to keep pushing. But it's interesting because you talked about it coming from kind of an immigrant mentality. So I'd love to hear more about what's the intersection look like between what you learned as being a child of refugees and immigrants that kind of framed your mindset about who you are, and then like masculinity, like where did you learn what it means to be a guy, and how did that impact you growing up?
Yeah, it's so funny because I think of it, part of when my family came to America, you think about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was like at the very base, it was like we were just surviving. And so there was not really any room for, how do you feel about this? It was like, well, you just got to, no one was like, how do you feel about leaving your country? You were like, okay, now you're in a refugee camp. Now you're in America. Now you're working. And so I think it really was sort of starting with that survival piece. And even, not even processing the trauma of leaving a country that you grew up in your whole life and then coming to a brand new place where you knew nobody. Like that, there was no, and I think this was back in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of like resources to help people adjust to a new life. And so I think the mentality that my family had, and a lot of immigrants had and still have to this day, is, okay, we're in survival mode. We're just going to push through it. So that means doing whatever we need to take for this one shot we have. If that means working multiple jobs, if it means doing whatever to provide for our families. And so I think growing up, my family, or my mom and my extended family, didn't ever learn those tools of like how to process trauma and how to think through checking in on our feelings. And I think that it wasn't just, I think, immigrants, but I think a lot of people in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it wasn't a topic that we just talked about at home. And so it really was about just surviving and getting through the day. And working multiple jobs to go to college, to be able to be successful. And I think, if the metric was, financial success, or the metric was being able to start a new life, I think my family was very successful in doing that. And it was really, I think now that, I grew up and I was able to be very lucky enough to grow up in a suburban house in the suburbs of Houston, and then go to a great school, and I feel very lucky. Then it's like, okay, now I have a little bit more capacity to be able to think about these things. And it was really through, my own experience of like, okay, no one was telling me I gotta think about my own mental health. But at some point, again, like pushing through it wasn't working. And so you hit this like brick wall, and at some point you realize, okay, I can't push through it any longer or any harder. And I think a lot of men Um, similarly, it's not about talking about your feelings. We don't grow up with a toolkit of saying, okay, how do you feel about this? It's like, men don't cry. It's like, oh, you didn't make the team. Okay, suck it up. Try harder. Right. So that mentality around not processing disappointment, not wallowing in your feelings, and not even acknowledging your feelings, really kind of stuffing them down so you can move forward, I think is something that I don't think we ever explicitly as men learn, but it's definitely something that's modeled to us. And it's something that's told to us. To be a man means not to cry, or to be a man means to like just suck it up. I think that mentality is something that eventually catches up with us. And you see, the statistics around, the number one cause of death for men under the age of 40 is the number two cause of death is actually suicide. And so you recognize that whether we're talking about it or not, it's happening. And I'm really happy for platforms like this and this show is that we have the chance to talk about it and model better behavior or model more healthy behavior.
Yeah, I'd be curious if you have thought about or kind of compared the difference when it comes to talking about approaching mental health related topics between the straight and the gay community. Do you find it different between the two?
Yeah, I think so. In some ways, the gay community, you're sort of aware of your own mental health. Like when I was coming out, there was no resources for me. So you go through this really tough situation of like having self-esteem issues and really not understanding is something wrong with me relative to my environment, and a lot of that internalized homophobia is something that happens. And a lot of my gay friends go to therapy, and it's because sort of again you push through it for so long and you can't do it for any longer. And there's a little bit more awareness maybe in your 20s that okay, I'm maybe drinking too much or going out too much, or I'm not feeling great about myself. And those are things that sort of are aha moments that get people to take their mental health more seriously. I think in the gay community, there our own set of challenges around like body image, self-esteem, eating disorders. Those things are really prevalent in the gay community. And I can't speak for everyone in the gay community, but I think that there is definitely a talk about mental health, or at least our own mental health among my male gay friends. And maybe it's that there's less pressure to be heteronormatively masculine, although there's still a lot of pressure in the gay community to fit into a certain mold. And so I think in that regard, the topic comes up more readily among my gay friends, or at least when someone brings up the topic of therapy, other people are more likely to be like, oh yeah, I see a therapist, or I love my therapist. And I think that it's really great actually to be able to get that support. And I think a lot of straight men don't necessarily have that support structure from other friends, whether they be, men or women or gay or straight. It's just, a little bit more isolated and lonely is my perception. And so I think when you don't know who to talk to and you don't have a support network, then you self-medicate. And that's usually through drinking or through drugs or through other things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think back to my experience too with therapy is in the beginning, I didn't want to tell anybody that I was in therapy. And I think as a matter of fact, for a long time, I didn't say anything about it, even though I was getting a ton out of it. It just felt like it wasn't I didn't know how people were going to react. And the last thing that I wanted to deal with was feeling like I didn't belong or that I was being judged. And I think there was a period of time when I described it as seeing a coach. He's like, oh, I'm working with a coach now. Like that was my code word for my therapist. And then finally I was just like, no, Beth is awesome. Like I would think everybody should go and see Beth if they possibly could. Like everybody needs a Beth in their life. So let's talk about that a little bit. You mentioned earlier that it was really your friends who had said, hey, have you thought about seeing a therapist? Like, do you remember the specific event when it actually clicked for you and you're like, yeah, maybe I should?
It was my roommate. I was living in San Francisco at the time. And it was one of my good friends from Northwestern, and we were living together. And she was a founder as well, someone I really respected. And I think we had these great, what I called couch talks, where we would sit down and once a week, like just talk about our lives. And the guys she was dating, the guys I was dating, potentially work-related stress that I was having, same with her. And I really found a lot of value from those conversations. And it was one of those things where I was like, I really love the fact that, in this crazy world of technology, we can sit down as two humans and just have a conversation. And we did it became like almost a ritual or a tradition where we were doing it, often. And I think I was getting a lot of value from that. And so she was like, oh, actually, if you love this so much, have you thought about seeing a therapist? And I was like, oh my God. And I remember the distinct reaction was like, oh, no, I'm not crazy. And I think there's so much loaded into that I'm not crazy, right? And then it really, for me, was sort of a preconceived notion I had for how bad you needed to be to go to see a therapist. It was like, for me, a therapist was like the last straw before, self-harm or something really, really negative. It was like, okay, that's really when you go, is like when you have no other options. And it was really, thanks to her and hearing from her about her own therapy experience and how helpful it was for her. And she was like, no, I was not at all that, in a place where I felt really as bad as you're describing what you need to be to see a therapist. And I got a ton of value from it. And she explained her experience a little bit more. And for me, it was like so eye-opening. Like, it was like I had a total preconceived notion for what therapy was like and the types of people who go to therapy. And I think when she kind of shattered that mold and was like, I'm not that person. And I think for me, well, now I know one person who went to therapy and it's not anything like who I thought goes to therapy. And so that opened me up to at least giving it a try and saying, this person I really respect, who I think the world of, can get some benefit from this, then, it's something that I think is worthwhile to at least try out.
Yeah, that just really shows how powerful it is being able to authentically share the story with somebody that you care about and sort of that safe space to be able to get it out there. Because it's, yeah, when I was in it, like, I didn't really know how to communicate. Like, there's not a class on like how to tell people you're in therapy, but there's plenty of classes, so to speak, on what therapy looks like. And it's either, I think, mostly through like movies and TV shows, right? I think is where most of us see what therapy is like. And it's like, oh, there's the therapists that work in the insane asylums, and I'm not that bad, right? Like, I'm not being I don't have to be pushed around in a wheelchair and helped to do all these things because I'm that incapacitated. And oh my gosh, like, totally, I can't even fathom what those people are going through inside of their heads. And then you've got the like sitting on a couch in a very sterile environment with somebody just like prodding your psyche, right? Trying to ask you about, what trauma did you have when you were a kid? And what do you think about your mother and all that type of stuff? And I never had either one of those experiences in therapy whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it got to the point where I just wanted to hang out with my therapist on a regular basis and talk about like what's going on in my head and like how can I learn more about it. Like, I loved it. So one of the challenges, and I think this is part of your story too, was you're like, all right, I'm ready to go see a therapist. How do I go and find one? And I'm realizing that I want to go there next, but first I want to touch on something that I think is really important. So you have this conversation with your friend and she shares with you, hey, Jonathan, this is what my experience with therapy is like. Maybe you're going to go and try it on. Did you go and like look for a therapist the next day, or were you still thinking like, maybe it's not bad enough?
I would say, and it's kind of like I'm remembering back now, it was not okay, open up my MacBook and start typing. It was really like the seed was planted, and I was like, okay, it's something I should think about. And I think it was one of those things where the seed was planted, and then I just kept thinking about it over the next few days, or the next few weeks. It took me probably at least a month or two to even just start the search, to even say, okay, and then part of it was sort of like, I don't even know where to go to start this search. And so it was really easy to put it off because I was like, okay, it's a nice to have. It's on my list of to-dos, but it's not at the top of my list of to-dos. And I think as I started thinking about it more, I was like, hey, let me just like Google it a little bit or learn a little bit more about therapy. And then I would say I'd read a few things, then I would like stop. And so I would say that, when I actually started to look for a therapist actively, it ended up being 6 months. And I say that my 6 month search for a therapist added more stress to my life.
Hmm.
Because then by that time I was like, okay, this is something that I recognize that I would want to do, but I have no idea A, where to go, and B, what to look for. And for me, that was a really frustrating experience. And I'm sure everyone has had this experience where they'll like find a long list of therapists from their insurance or online, and then they'll call each therapist. And I remember I probably called 10 therapists and maybe two got back to me at all.
Yes. Yes.
And I was like, I'm at the someone where like now I'm like, okay, I'm ready, world. I'm ready for help. I'm ready to talk to somebody. And then no one's calling me back. And I was like, this is the worst situation possible. Because you think about like to get to the point where I was ready was a 30+ year journey. And I think of it, and that's like I joke that therapy has a horrible marketing problem. And that marketing problem is really like that image of what therapy is, and partially because therapists are really great at working with their clients. They're really horrible with marketing and with business management and with returning phone calls and doing all the basic things that surround the therapy experience. And they don't, honestly, I talked to the dean of one of the top therapy programs in the Bay Area, and she was like, we don't prepare our students to work in private practice. Like you take
Mm.
0 business courses, you take no real courses in working in private practice. You do a ton of work, potentially working community mental health centers or working in clinics. And so that's the world that people are more aware of. And so the basic practices of managing your inbox and returning your phone calls or explaining what you do as a therapist and dispelling myths for therapy was something that just therapists never learned how to do. And so now that like I've seen behind the curtain, I'm like, oh, it makes total sense why no one called me back, because they're probably not even checking their voicemails, or they're busy doing other things. And so, but in the moment when I was going through that experience, I was like, this is the worst. It made me feel worse about myself, I think, because I was like, okay, now that I need help, or that I recognize I need help, and I'm asking for help, and then there's like nobody on the other line. That felt really alone. I felt really alone.
That was
Um,
the worst part from what I remember, right? Is that you've got, like you said, you've got that long list, which is overwhelming in the first place. There's no Yelp. Maybe some of them are on Yelp. Maybe some of them have Google reviews, maybe, but they're probably from people that had a really crappy experience. And so
yeah,
you're like, well, I'm not going to call this person. And then, yeah, to your point, you, nobody gets back to you. And in that moment, when you're there thinking about, you're ready for help and support, and then people aren't getting back to you, I couldn't help except ask myself the question, like, what's wrong with me? Like, am I that bad, or am I not bad enough? And that's just a path that you don't need to be going down when you're at that place, right?
it's the last thing that you should be thinking about in that moment is attributing this horrible process to what's wrong with you. And but I had the exact same thoughts. I was like, why is no one calling back? Like, what is like? And then I think for me, I was very lucky that I was never in a really, really horrible situation. But I can imagine, the clients that we work with now are across the spectrum of severity. And there are a lot of clients who've tried therapy many times and had a horrible experience, and others who are trying it for the first time. And I think about like, we always congratulate people once they start therapy. And it's one of those things where it's like, it is a congratulation moment because you're doing something for yourself. And so for when I think about kind of when I went through that process, I was like, this is so horrible. Someone should fix this. This is like, someone should fix this. And then I remember, I would be talking to friends. It'd be like a couple weeks later, and I'd be like, and they'd be like, yeah, I had a horrible experience. My therapist, no one called me back, or I didn't even know where to start. And then I started thinking, okay, well, if someone were to fix this, this is what they should do. And then it was like months would go by, and then it sort of kind of became this thing where like, it felt like an idea that had some gravity that kept pulling me back. And it was either through conversations I was having with friends or experiences I'm having where I was like, okay, I have an idea of what I think could help, to take someone from, hey, I might need help, or I might want to see a therapist, to that point where they're in therapy with someone who's amazing, who's a good fit for them, who's the right therapist. I want to make that time as short as possible so that the work that's being done can be focused on the actual therapy itself. Because therapy is work, right? Working on your mental health, changing bad habits, undoing negative thought patterns. That's work. Getting into the rooms should not be where people drop off. And I think the statistic that we found is, despite so many people needing mental health support, 80% of those who have a mental health need never get the right care. 80%. It's because people don't call them back. It's because and even for me, I probably tried 3 therapists before I found one that was really great for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was with the first one for 6 or 8 months. And I think I was just someone who had the will to continue, but I didn't even recognize, is this the right fit for me? Or is this a bad fit? I thought, okay, well, this is my first experience in therapy. It doesn't feel like it's working, but I guess this is how therapy works. So I just got to continue through this path. And I think there are so many people that along the way are like, this is such crap. It's not working. And then they stop therapy altogether. And I always say, you have one bad haircut, you don't stop getting your haircut for the rest of your life. And so in therapy, it's that same experience. And I think for us, helping people to hold them through that process. At Reflect, our mission is to make mental health more accessible. And that is about getting someone from, hey, I might need help, through to finding an amazing therapist reliably and quickly. And I think that of itself is something that we can do to help people get care, so that the experience that I had, and probably the one that you had, becomes more and more rare over time. And I would love it to be the day where no one has that bad experience, where a therapist doesn't call them back. And they know, it's a really smooth process, and it's one that changes people's lives. And so for me, that's sort of our mission at Reflect.
Well, I feel fortunate that we have somebody like you and the team at Reflect trying to make that path easier, because it's not. As somebody who's been through it and has had family members go through it and has advised many friends on how to do it as best as they possibly can, it certainly isn't easy. And I know that you and I talked when we first met about this, because our timelines were just so similar in our overlap in San Francisco and seeing a therapist for the first time. And I forgot to tell you this when we were first talking, but when I was working with my therapist, I was also trying to get back on my feet. And I really, really wanted to go start a company. And she's like, Adam, just go get a freaking job. You need some stability. That's going to help you kind of build back up. But I was so obsessed with figuring this problem out. And I'd call my therapist and I'd be like, hey, I don't need a therapy session, but can I do a customer interview with you? Because I'd like to go and solve this problem. We talked about all those things, her marketing, her responding to people's phone calls, digging into all the stuff that I know you did as well. And then the irony here is that she kept advising me not to go and do it. She's like, Adam, this is definitely a problem. Somebody needs to go and solve this. I just need to be totally honest with you. It might be you in the future. It's not you right now. And I was like, okay. I hear this message. I finally came it through. Little did I know, Jonathan's behind the scenes, cranking away at Reflect. So let's talk about that. So you've got this issue. You eventually find a great therapist, which we'll come back to a little bit later. But let's talk about getting Reflect off the ground. How did it start? How's it going?
Yeah, I mean, Adam, we could have been co-founders in another life. In another life, we would have, or competitors. Who knows?
No, except we get to do this. We get to go on a mandate instead, and we'll collaborate on something even bigger in the future.
So much, yes. I mean, and I actually think that, at that time when I was looking into this idea, I remember I was telling my mentor from Bain, I was talking about the idea I had for therapy and for making therapy. I knew that there was a problem. I didn't know what the solution was. And I remember he was saying, he's like, Jonathan, I don't think therapy is going to be a thing. It's so stigmatized. And this was probably 4 years ago. And I remember thinking, I was a spin instructor. I had did a lot of work around my physical health. And I knew that given all the conversations I was having with everyone in my life, this topic was coming up, and it was coming up more than, randomly. It was actually the norm, not the exception, that people were thinking about their mental health or had a burnout situation. And so um, I think that those conversations, I thought about like, okay, is this really what I want to be doing? Like I'm the kind of guy who, like, probably like you, I can walk into a shop and think about all the ways I would change the layout and the experience. And so I have new ideas all the time. But it really was sort of the pull back and kind of the universe telling me this is a problem that needs to be solved that kept bringing me back. And so I was like, hey, now I just want to learn more about. I don't know what I'm going to do to solve it, but I know there's a problem and I want to figure out what the problem is. And so I had probably 200 coffee chats with therapists and with people that I knew who had gone through the therapy search, whether they tried therapy or not, whether it was a good experience or not. I just wanted to learn, like, was my experience and my frustrations common? And what was it like for the therapist? Like, was there something I just did not see? And I had no idea what it was like to be a therapist. And so those conversations for me were really eye-opening, because it wasn't like me taking a solution and force fitting it into the world. It was like, I don't know anything. I want to learn. And the number one thing I learned was that the best predictor of success in therapy was not all the jargon. It wasn't all of the, orientation types. It wasn't where they went to school. It was none of the things that I thought were important. It was what was called therapeutic alliance, which is the fit between you and your therapist. So I was like, oh God, I thought it was about school and degree and all these things. And none of those really, the data shows none of those have a strong impact to actually someone having good outcomes in therapy. So I was like, okay, well, how do you determine therapeutic alliance? And there was really not a lot of good information out there. And so these conversations that I had were really helpful, because I would ask people, when you had a horrible experience with your therapist, what was that like? What was missing? And then when you had an amazing experience, what was different about that? And what was there? And what did you love about it? And so all of those conversations ended up informing what we developed internally at Reflect around our matching algorithm. So we use data from when you come to Reflect and you're looking for a therapist, we collect information from you on your background, your history, what you might want in a therapist. And we ask you questions that personally, when I went through the experience, I didn't even know I should be asking myself. And what we do is we marry that. I was when I was thinking about it, again, I was talking about, like, what degree do you have? I never once asked, like, what it's like to be in the room with you. Like, are you someone who helps their clients process information and look at their history and kind of think through it and examine their life? Or are you someone who's more skills-based, who's more solution-oriented, who really helps them with concrete tools and skills? That's a fundamental difference. And some people going into therapy are looking for one or looking for the other. But oftentimes the frustrations I would hear is like, oh, I knew this was a problem or an area that I wanted to work on. And my therapist kept asking me to talk about my childhood. And I was like, okay, I can talk about it all day, but I'm not feeling it's helpful. And I think that mismatch in expectation was one where it made me realize, okay, well, we should probably tease out what someone wants in entering into this relationship and what someone else can offer in the relationship. Just like any relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or a career relationship or anything else, it's like if you expect the job to be one thing and the other person expects it to be something totally different, it's going to be a bad situation. And so what we do is we ask you, as someone looking for therapy, about a bunch of these different questions to help tease out your personality, what you might want in a therapist. And then we actually collect data from our therapist. And so we pre-vet. We're the largest non-insurance network of therapists in California. And with every therapist that we vet and bring on, we make sure they're good quality. Then we collect data on what it's like to be in the room with the therapist themselves. And so
how do you get that data, out of curiosity?
It's a number of different things. So we interview the therapist, we have them self-rate themselves, and then we actually get feedback from their existing clients who come onto the Reflect platform.
Oh, cool.
And so we're able to really, if a therapist says, I do this, well, do they really do that, or do they say they do that? And then what do their actual clients think about what they say they do? And all that information goes into the algorithm. And so we're able to match clients with the right therapist for them. And we use over 55 different factors in matching. And so as someone who was going through the process, I knew all of these things were things that I was considering, but I had no idea the order of importance. Like, does the fact that someone is in my neighborhood, is that more important than whether they're Asian? Is that more important than, well, do they assign homework, and are they solution oriented? Like, there's so many of these different factors. And so for us, what we do is we actually take all that data and we match you to multiple therapists in our platform, and then you can try each therapist for free for 20 minutes. And we
Oh,
believe,
cool.
at the end of the day, it's a little bit of art and a little bit of science. And the science is the algorithm and what the algorithm recommends as a match. But then we facilitate a process where it's not unlike dating, where we give you questions that you can ask your potential matches. And these are completely free 20-minute conversations via phone. And the goal is to, before I pay anything, before I go and invest any more into this relationship, let's just have an interview and assess whether this is a good fit for me and whether I'm a good fit for you as a therapist. Because maybe what I want is something that you can't do. And if I joined your practice, I would always feel dissatisfied with the situation. And so as a therapist, bringing on a new client is also really, really, it's laborious, because you're investing a lot in learning about this new client. You're investing a lot into figuring out, creating a treatment plan, helping this person out. And so before we jump right in, let's take a pause and let's just assess whether we're a good fit. And what's really amazing is the algorithm plus this fit-based matching plus these conversations. We're really proud that 80% of those who go through our process find a therapist they like with Reflect. 80%. And so we are very sure, and we've done thousands of matches, done tens of thousands of sessions. We know that as long as we get you in the room with an amazing therapist who's a good fit, then the magic happens. Then the life-changing exploration happens. Then lives are being changed. But it's like, how can we get you into that room in a more reliable way and a more trusted way? And we're really proud that I think we've created something very, very unique, to take a lot of that ownership and the guesswork and a lot of that labor out of the process, so you can spend time focusing on the therapy itself.
It sounds like you guys have built out some really amazing stuff that if I was ever in the market again, and it sounds like in California, I would definitely be excited to try it. So I know that my little thing that'll pop up here every now and again says SF in LA, but you guys have expanded beyond that. What does it look like for folks who are not in California? What's the plan to get this to everybody?
That's a great question. And I mean, we have great resources. So even if you're not in an area that Reflect serves, like our blog has this really lengthy article on how to find a right therapist. And so our mission is, whether we can help you and we're in your market or we're not in where you serve, we want everyone to find a great therapist. So we hope that the resources that we provide are helpful for everybody. So you can go to our website, joinreflect.com, and there's a blog link. And we'll have tons of resources to help people looking for a therapist. But we're very excited that, we started in the Bay Area, we launched in LA, and we actually are across California now, doing both in-person and teletherapy. We added teletherapy as an option with COVID, and we're excited that's allowed us to help serve more people. And our plan is to launch in multiple states in the next couple of months. So we will be in more places soon. And we always ask, if you're looking for a therapist, some of our therapists are licensed across multiple states. And so you can get on our wait list, or you can go and try us. And if we can't help you, we can at least give you more resources. And so there is a long and growing wait list. And I think our team is working really hard to get to more places soon, because we realize that, even as you and I are having this conversation, there are lots of people out there looking for a therapist right now that could benefit from Reflect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure COVID has accelerated the interest on those wait lists. For you guys, have you seen any difference in the sessions happening via, telemedicine, Zoom type setups versus in person, in terms of, like, I can imagine, hey, I go and I sit with you in person and we're a great fit, but we're on a Zoom call and I'm kind of like, maybe I'm not vibing with this person.
So we started Reflect for the first couple years. We did only in-person therapy, and that was our differentiator. And I had seen a lot of these platforms that were doing like text-based therapy or video-based therapy. And I heard a lot of like mixed reviews, and so we were very, very weary of doing telehealth and teletherapy. And it was really amazing. And sort of COVID forced us to reevaluate that assumption and saying, I remember it was March of last year when shelter in place was happening in the Bay Area. And I think we were like, okay, we've got to sort of switch. More people need help right now. We cannot just anchor on this in-person piece. And what I realized was my preconceived notion against teletherapy was really driven by the fact that it wasn't a good fit. And so the fit piece is actually really important. What we've seen over and over again is, our conversion and our retention data from those who try us wanting in-person versus teletherapy is equally strong. And actually the results are even better. They're like, oh, like I switched from in-person to teletherapy and I love the experience. I mean, I would rather be in the room with my therapist, but I can't be in the room with my therapist. And so it's one of those things where this has become a really great and very convenient alternative. And so we now offer both in-person and teletherapy. And I have personally, the biggest skeptic of teletherapy, have been really, really pleasantly surprised. And I think it's really because it's not the medium that was where the mixed reviews were not about the medium, it was about the fit itself. And so whether you're in person or, it's probably easier to start therapy via teletherapy. And so a lot of people kind of just get, they might find someone online or they might find someone through some platforms. And it ends up being not a good fit. And so that's attributed to the luck of the draw. But we feel like because we're using the same algorithm and we're still letting you try them all via phone, when you're sitting down, whether that's in person or you're sitting down via video, you're having a really great experience.
Got it. Yeah. So I know that you mentioned that you've got this really great, robust blog post that has a ton of resources in it, and I'll make sure that we link to it in the show notes across the different platforms. Let's talk through, if you don't mind, can we give people, a quick set of those tips so that if people are sitting here thinking, okay, I'm willing to give this therapy thing a try, how do I go and get started if I can't use Reflect?
Yes. So that I had initially going in. And so I'll talk through some of the factors that I looked into, and then maybe things that I realized through our experience will be helpful if I were going through that search again and did not have Reflect.
Cool.
So I thought I had no idea the difference between a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a therapist. And so for me, as someone who was like, okay, I guess education's important. And so I want someone who's a doctor and I want someone who went to a great school. We have no psychiatrists on our platform at all. And I think that what I realized through the process is psychiatrists, while they do therapy, a lot of them do medication management and helping with providing pharmacological solutions for whatever you might need. And I think, standard of care is having that in addition to therapy. And so that was a big aha moment for me, is I never knew that was the way that the world worked. And then we work with both psychologists and master's level therapists. And psychologists are those who've had a doctorate degree. And it might be either a PsyD or what's called like a PhD in psychology. We found there's no difference really in satisfaction across these different degree types. There are some things that psychologists can do that a therapist cannot do. That's really more around assessments and like a little like behavioral assessments. But in terms of severity, in terms of types of clients, I saw a master's level therapist I've only seen master's level therapists, and they were phenomenal to me. And so for me, that preconceived notion around education or degree was something I thought was really, really important, and it ended up being not important at all. Instead, I think what's really important is when we talk about this idea of fit, what is fit? And so there's some things that you can imagine that are demographic related. So do you want to see a man or a woman, someone who's older or younger, someone who's your race or a different race? Everyone has certain preconceived notions, and it's not really about saying that those things necessarily matter, but if they're helpful for you to build trust, then those are things that obviously are screening criteria that you can look for in therapist that you might want to work with. And you might want to try different things out. And so for me, I've tried as someone who's intersectional, where I'm Asian and gay, I looked at both gay male therapists, and I also looked at Asian therapists. And for a while, I saw a gay male therapist, and then I switched and I see currently an Asian female therapist. And so I had fundamentally different experiences. I worked on different things. So the demographical and the background of that therapist may be important for anyone who might be. So that's a criteria that I think is like sort of something that matters to some people and doesn't matter to others. So if you're looking for a therapist, think about those pieces. But then what's really, really important is the therapeutic style. And so there are all these buzzwords around orientation, psychodynamic or CBT or DBT. Those are all helpful. And I would think about those as sort of like, what is the toolkit the therapist has to work with you? But any therapist can work with any person. But it's more around what is the right style for you. And so I won't go through all the different styles, but there's some styles that are more solution-oriented or skills-based, like CBT or DBT. And CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. And so some of those skills-based therapies might resonate more with people who like concrete skills. Okay, I like that when I'm feeling stressed, I have this skill that I can remember back to and practice. And so if that's the kind of person that you are and you like these concrete skills, you might benefit from therapists who practice those orientations. But oftentimes what I would do is I look at their websites and I review kind of how they like to work with their clients. And then I ask them, hey, how do you actually work with your clients? And I don't think that's a question that a lot of clients even think they're allowed to ask, right? Like when I look for, a GP to go as my doctor, I don't ask them these questions. And so a lot of times we don't think like we're allowed to ask, how do you practice? Because you're the expert and I'm sort of the patient. So I'm just going to like trust you. I think that's really good, but knowing what you're getting yourself into and really pushing that therapist to articulate what they do and how they do it. And really ask, I'm someone who's really burned out at work and I'm really struggling with like motivation at work, debating switching my career, and I don't know what to do. How would you work with me? And really get an idea of what that therapist would do with you, how they approach the problem. That is a very fair question. I don't think enough people ask. And I think, but when you hear that answer, think about, okay, does this sound like something that works well for me?
I like that difference between not asking them what they would do, but how they go about doing it, I think is a good framing. Or it's almost like you're trying to ask them, hey, describe to me what I could expect in one of our sessions. What's it going to be like? Paint me a picture of a day in the life or an hour in the life of being your patient.
Exactly. And I firmly believe that like any relationship, and this is a business relationship, it's up to the therapist to be able to articulate what they do. And so many therapists are like, oh, just, start therapy and you'll find out. And I was like, well, I'm not going to pay hundreds of dollars just to find out that you're a horrible fit for me. And I think many, many therapists do these, free short consultation calls as a way to assess. And so that's something that I think, and when you hear what they're saying and you hear the conversation, I would encourage the folks listening to think about two things. One is, does this style resonate with me? Do I feel like I enjoy, like I would benefit from, I'm excited by this style of therapy? And then secondly, as I'm talking to this person, do I feel comfortable to talk about the issues that are bothering me? Do I feel like I'm going to be able to bring up this topic to the therapist? So they make me feel comfortable. And of course, you're not going to be so comfortable from day one, but is there the potential for that to happen over time? And so if you're someone who has a deep, dark issue that you're really ashamed about, this is the venue to be able to talk about it risk-free. And this is the person to talk about it. And so if you really have to feel comfortable saying things that you might not say to anybody else. And that initial conversation, really assessing what they do and how they do it. and thinking about, okay, do I feel comfortable sharing? And it could be one of those things like a date where you're like, this is a great person. They seem really nice. This sounds like it's a great approach. I just don't feel a connection. And that's okay. And that's one where you have to assess whether or not you want to take that leap of faith or whether you want to try a couple people out. And what's great is, once you try a couple, you realize, oh, that first one that I thought wasn't a fit, I've actually like really liking that first person again. Like I want to start with them. But you won't know that until you compare a few therapists.
Yeah, which can sometimes be frustrating for sure. So a couple of questions that have rolled in. The first one is, can somebody do teletherapy with a therapist in a different state?
So the answer is it depends. And I wish that was not the answer, but thanks to federalism and all these rules that happen at the federal level versus the state level. So therapy is licensed on a state by state basis. And so the boards of the state of Texas are very different than the boards of the state of California. The good news is through COVID, a lot of the federal regulations around preventing people from seeing a therapist across state lines has become lax. That's the great news. And I think that's a recognition from the APA and other folks that there's an unprecedented time right now where people are more isolated. And so the opportunity to meet that need is more important than these state by state regulations. That said, there's still states where there are some states that provide waivers to allow their therapists to work with clients from other states, and some states do not. And so it's really an area that is emerging. I believe, this is really, we're going to see a lot of changes in the regulations over the next few years, as we would with everything post-COVID. We're recognizing things that we thought were really important are not as important. We do have therapists that are able and are licensed in other states. And so I think if you're looking for a therapist, check out Reflect. But as you're interviewing with therapists, you can look for therapists in your area that do teletherapy. But sometimes you might find a great therapist that's in a different area, and then you would just ask them, are they willing to work with clients that are in your state or your area? And what you might find is there's also a personal preference. Some therapists are like, I'm totally open to working with someone outside of my state, and there are no regulatory issues of why I can't do that. And then other therapists are like, I can do it, but I don't feel comfortable. I don't like doing it. And so they may not be a good fit. And so unfortunately, I wish the answer was yes, but it really is, it depends. And I think it's a great question to ask, especially as you think about the therapy search, because there are some areas and there are some places in the country where there aren't a great depth of amazing therapists that are qualified. And so I think the push is to be able to get people more access to therapy and so I hope that is, I think the change is going to be very beneficial so that people who are really struggling, who don't have therapists in the area, can still get high quality care.
For sure. And then there's a clarification from earlier on the Reflect platform. Do you have master level therapist, psychologist, and psychiatrist, or like just one of those? What's the mix of people that are on the platform?
Yeah, great question. So we have master's level therapists, and then we have doctorate level psychologists, but we don't work with psychiatrists.
Got it. Cool. Thanks for that clarification. And so another piece that I want to talk about real quick is the phenomenon or the experience that you had where you reach out to all these therapists. So people like, they go and they read the blog post. They're like, cool, I know how I'm going to find a great therapist. Nobody's calling you back. Given what you've learned so far, what should people do with not getting a call back? Should they be persistent? Should they just move on? What can they do?
So I will tell you, for those who are listening, this will likely happen. And I hope it does not happen to you. It will likely happen. And I will, on behalf of the industry, apologize for that. And I want you to remember, when it does happen, it is nothing related to you or your need. It happens most frequently with insurance. And there are some cost and structural reasons why. So if you're going through your insurance company and you're calling therapists, you're going to have a high likelihood of no one calling you back because the slots for insurance patients is very, very limited. So you have to be persistent. And what I would say is, call 10 people, but still have, there's a tendency you call 10 people, only 2 get back to you. So you're like, okay, I'm just going to pick one of these people. Still go through that same process with both the people that call you back and really assess whether they're the right fit. And if they're not the right fit, call 10 more. Because you don't want to settle for somebody, because what happens is you settle for them because you're like, I'm just exhausted. I'm ready to start this process. And then 3 or 4 sessions in, you're like, this is a horrible match. And you got to start it all. And then what happens is you end up then not moving forward. You just quit therapy and stop it altogether. And I don't want that to happen to you. And so be persistent, really call. And, instead of calling 2 or 3, call 10 or 15. And you can email them, you can call them. And have those conversations, but you have to be persistent. And you have to recognize that this is all worth it once you find the right therapist. And I promise you, so internally at Reflect, whenever someone goes through a process and chooses a therapist, we ring a bell. And it is a reminder to us that someone's life is changing. And I promise you, when we get feedback back from our clients, once they've been through the process and start therapy, they always say, gosh, I really wish I had not waited. Or this is totally worth it now. And so when you're in the middle of it, you can't see it. You can only see how annoyingly difficult and hard it is. But I'm here to tell you, like, it's worth it. And whether you do it now or you put it off, these are things that you're going to work on for yourself. And they're going to only make you stronger and better and more resilient. And so pushing through, this is something where I would be like, you got to just push through it. And you just got to push through that process of looking for the therapist, because it will be worth it in the end.
And how do you think about what people can do in that during the process, right? So like, you don't have a therapist, you've identified that you could really use some help. Is there any recommendations you've got for people? Like, how can they take care of themselves? Maybe find some good people to talk to that aren't necessarily therapists, but can kind of be there for them. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think what surprised me most about my experience and going through this process, it was actually kind of like the coming out process, where I was so scared of telling someone I was gay. And then I was like, I had some good experiences and I had some bad coming out experience. It's not all rainbows and butterflies, but by and large, I was like, it was not nearly as bad as I thought it was. And so I think if you have a group of friends, I've asked my business school classmates, and talked about therapy. And I've been really even surprised at this very professional organization at work, even for my ex-colleagues at work in consulting, one where everyone seemed like they were invincible and like type A workaholics. When I brought up the topic, I was really surprised at how people melted away and kind of shared and were more vulnerable. And so I think it's really one of those things where people I was surprised at how open people were to have a conversation. And so I would encourage folks to not hold it inside. And therapy is one avenue, but you should feel, if you're comfortable speaking to this with a couple of trusted friends and asking them, like, have they ever tried therapy? What's that experience like? And I think, I can't speak for everyone. And I think, but I don't think anyone has not had a situation where they've had some tough issue in their life and they've had some mental health moment. And especially with COVID in this last year, I think we've all recognized how anxious and how stressed and how the world is. And so we're more open than ever to talk about these topics. And so I think my first piece of advice is just be a little brave if you feel comfortable, and have that conversation and bring it up to somebody that you trust, because you might be really surprised at how welcome they are. And they may say, I've never tried it, or I've tried therapy, but I want to listen to, and I want to hear how things are. And I think that connection, we as humans, we search for that connection, and we want to be there for our friends. And oftentimes we just don't know how bad it is for our friends. And so it just takes one person to start that conversation. So that's my first piece of advice, is just, try to step out your comfort zone and have those conversations. The second would be, there's a tendency, even for, me and for other folks, to wait till it's really bad to go see a therapist. And knowing the process is going to be frustrating. I think what's really hard is when you wait till you're like desperately needing a therapist. Your capacity, you're in triage mode. So you're really like underwater. So the capacity for you to call 10 people and have these conversations is a lot lower. And so I would encourage folks before they're at that point to sort of like dip their toe into the water and explore therapy. And I think when you're feeling like things are great, it's the best time to go to therapy. It's kind of like the people who do premarital counseling. You know, a lot of like religions have this where like they encourage you and your partner to go see a either it's a minister or a therapist beforehand, because you're like, okay, let's just understand, do we all want children, and do we think about money the same way, and it's one of those things where like you'd rather have that conversation when you're both like in love than 6 months down the line or a year down the line when that honeymoon period has stopped. And so in that same way, I would encourage folks, when you feel like you have capacity, start that search and don't wait till you're really, really underwater.
I was smiling so big there because I called my therapist when I was thinking about proposing to my now wife, and I said, "Hey, I know that you do marriage and family therapy. Is it okay to go talk to you before we get married? Like, just to make sure that like everything will be that much better? Because like things are really good right now." She was like, Adam, I wish more people came to me and asked that question, because the answer is yes. And like we had these like great sessions with her where we did learn a lot of new stuff, and it did create, a great foundation. So that was kind of funny that you brought that up too. But I'm with you on those two parting messages. I always like to ask people, if you've got some words of wisdom that you want to leave the audience with. But I think we should end there with find that extra courage in the people that you trust to be able to share where you're at, and they might be right there with you, or maybe a couple steps ahead, and can say, "Oh, you know what? You should talk to Steven. He might be a great guy for you," or just be able to support you when you maybe aren't getting those phone calls back, or don't have Reflect in the area and need to stay after it. And then, if you've got the capacity to start before you like actually need it, is always a good place to begin. So with that, I know we actually didn't get to a lot of the topics that we plan to talk about, so you might have to come on for Mandate Part 2. I'd love to take you out again at some point in time. If you enjoyed our first date together.
I'm excited. This is my first second date of COVID, so this is great. I would love to have another conversation with you, Adam.
Love it. Well, we will definitely make that happen. I so appreciated you coming on today. I know there's a lot of wisdom that people will normally can hear, but especially right now. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and I love this forum that you created for these conversations is so important, and I'm so excited to see this thing take off. So thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Jonathan for being here, for you guys tuning in. Cool to see some questions roll in today that we had a chance to ask. So that is why we do these lives. If you've got questions for our guest, we're all willing to open up and share things here. So make sure to ask those. Lots of fun stuff coming up. Thanks as always for being part of the Mandate and helping this community get off the ground and spread the message of men's mental health, well-being, and healthy forms of looking at our masculinity and identity. So have a great rest of your night, great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to The Mandate with your host, Adam Hoffman. It's time to do your part in raising awareness of men's mental health, shifting the stigma, and having a positive impact on someone's life. Share this episode with a friend who could use some support and post it on your social channels. Have questions or thoughts? Text Adam at 512-980-3935. Find more episodes, upcoming live shows, and life-changing resources at mandateshow.com. Your mandate is to take your mental health seriously. Be courageous, stay vulnerable, live authentically. Until next time, y'all.